Welcome back, my friend. My name is Victor Nieves. This is the Victor Nieves Show. I tell you what, in the last week since our previous episode, it feels like it's been, 2 months or something. The number of things that have happened, obviously, we'll have to talk about this. Donald Trump was convicted on, 34 felony counts. Donald J. Trump. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk, the big conversation for today will be focused around states' rights. Obviously, it is also Pride Month. I know that you, my listener, I know that you have probably been really looking forward to celebrating the wonders of Pride Month. So get ready for that. We're going to have that shoved down our throat for the next month. That's always a wonderful time. Before we jump into that, though, as always, I want to start the program off the best way that I know how. That's by taking just a second to give glory and honor to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I have been so tremendously, undeservedly blessed in the short time that I have been on this planet. You, my listener, you are a tremendous blessing. And sincerely, I thank God for each and every one of you that has listened over the years. The audience continues to grow, and I don't understand it, but I am so thankful to God for it. Now, let's jump in a little bit and first and foremost talk about this Trump conviction. We'll get that out of the way. In the past, not too long ago, I talked in pretty great detail about the Trump, at that time it was just the Trump trial. He had not yet been convicted in this bogus witch hunt. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you expect out of a third world. You don't expect that to happen here in the United States. And I broke down all of the details about how the DOJ, for example, was involved, where the number 3, in fact, at the DOJ was sent to this, little local DA's office. Talk about a demotion in position. He goes from number 3 at the DOJ down to this little local Manhattan place so he can figure out the prosecution of Donald Trump. We went into all of it. The big takeaways that you need to know are that, for one, this Judge Merchan, and by the way, I'm saying all of this not because I don't think that you already know it, but maybe to help provide you with information to rebuttal anyone who says that this was somehow a fair trial and a fair conviction of Donald Trump. If they don't know these things, be sure to send them this, send them this show, or just, relay this in your own words. But Judge Merchan is actually a Democrat donor. Think about that. We could leave it there. We could literally leave it there, not talk about a single other thing in this case. The judge is a Democrat donor, a guy who is a known Trump hater. His daughter raised nearly $100 million. I think it was, to be exact, $93 million she fundraised off of her father's trial. Think of the insanity of that. You have a judge who's a known Trump-hating Democrat donor, and his daughter is raising nearly $100 million. That in and of itself, this is not a fair trial. This is not some conviction that was just a pursuit of law and order. The Democrats' response to a lot of this has been, I thought Donald Trump and Republicans wanted there to be law and order. Yeah, believe it or not, law and order implies a certain understanding of equal application of justice in this country. It implies that we're not going to pursue frivolous witch hunts against our political adversaries, okay? If you can't see the nuance, the slight difference between a Soviet show trial and arresting a violent criminal on the street and then prosecuting him as a violent criminal, you might not have the faculties required to vote. Maybe you should sit this one out, okay? Politics might not be for you. If you think that a Soviet show trial is in any way comparable to law and order. But so just off of that, we're talking about a judge who has, which judges really kind of aren't supposed to do this, a judge who has donated money specifically against Donald Trump. His daughter is raising all of this money. You also have the fact that this is a Democrat judge, a Democrat prosecutor, a Democrat jury in a Democrat district in a Democrat state. This is a place, Manhattan, that was about 95% Joe Biden. You won't find very many places like that in the entire country. 95% Joe Biden. They refused intentionally. This tells you everything that you need to know. They refused a change of venue because they wanted it to be Judge Merchan. They wanted it. By the way, he's a third world import. I don't know if you knew that or not. Judge Merchan comes from, I believe it was Colombia. He's an actual import from outside of this country. How well did that work out? But you have all of these confounding variables. If you ever encounter, though, a liberal who is just determined to tell you that this was a fair trial, Donald Trump was fairly convicted, you do the crime, you gotta do the time. If you run into somebody like that, just ask them, okay, what was the crime? Just curious, right? If this liberal feels so determined to convince you that Donald Trump has committed some form of a crime, just ask them, okay, what was the crime since you feel so strongly about it? I will be shocked if they can provide you an answer, mostly because the prosecution couldn't provide an answer. The jury seemingly didn't have to provide an answer. The judge didn't know either. As for the part about the jury not having to provide an answer, Merchan, you may have heard a little bit about this, he said that the jury doesn't have to be unanimous. I mean, think about that. My head's exploding over here. The judge tells the jury that they don't have to be unanimous in this case, at least as to what crime Donald Trump committed. They just have to agree that he committed a crime. He presented them something of what's being referred to as a legal buffet. You get to pick and choose. You get to say, maybe 4 of the jurors might say that he committed crime A. Another 4 might say crime B, and another 4 might say crime C. They don't agree as to what the crime was. They just agree that, well, I think he did something bad, therefore we're just going to convict him. Merchan's instructions to the jury, if that wasn't confusing enough, were 50 pages. It took him about a half hour to 45 minutes every time he had to read off the jury instructions. By the way, the jurors were not provided a copy of said instructions. For reference, this episode is around 43 minutes long in its totality, start to finish around 43 minutes long. That is approximately the same amount of time that it took the judge to explain the juror instructions to these individuals. Do you think that you could memorize every single thing that I'm saying to you in the next 40 minutes? No, of course not. You don't stand a snowball's chance unless you have some sort of an incredible photographic memory. If you do, props to you. But what are the odds that all those jurors even understood their instructions? Now, traditional wisdom when it comes to prosecutions is that a confused jury doesn't convict. You'll hear that when you talk to the prosecutors and defense. That's not a golden rule, but you hear it an awful lot. The difference is maybe a confused jury does convict when they're talking about somebody that they already hate, okay? When they're sitting here, 95% of the population disliking Donald Trump to start with, this is a Soviet show trial. And if you want a little bit more, just scratching the surface on that, that's not the primary conversation we're having today. If you want more information on that, I do have a prior episode where we dig into everything. We dig into more of the details as far as, the fact that the prior DA didn't want to bring this case. The FEC didn't want to bring this case. The mental gymnastics that went into creating this abomination of, for real, a Soviet show trial. If you want that, you can find that. We talked about that in the past. But what I do want to say before we depart completely from this conversation is that I have raised the alarm in the past. And I've said, listen, as a student of history, and you may be a student of history as well, you may know exactly what I'm talking about here. As a student of history, when you study the fall of a republic and the rise of either an empire or a tyrannical government that takes its place, this has happened throughout history in the past. We saw this, for example, in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, the dawn of the Caesars actually happened in part, not solely, but in part, because of the threat of political persecution through the judicial system. That's actually a very interesting study on what happened with Rome, and the fact that Caesar's opponents were threatening to essentially put him in jail. Sound familiar? Anyways, if you're a student of history and you know what happens whenever a republic dies and it's replaced by a tyrannical government, a dictatorship, whatever it might be, typically, it's not actually, we just discussed this maybe in the last episode or the one prior, it's not so much the frog in a boiling pot of water. We hear that analogy a lot, but it's not quite accurate to say that it's a frog in a boiling pot, because for a time that may be true, but eventually you reach something that I suppose we can describe as a critical mass. You reach a point where the Rubicon has been crossed, and it's now neck break acceleration. Things begin to happen extraordinarily fast. With Donald Trump being convicted on what are objectively bogus, made-up, Banana Republic-style convictions, I just want to issue a warning to everyone to be paying really close attention and prepare accordingly, just in case things begin to accelerate. Having said that, let's kind of segue here a bit into the overarching conversation that I had promised today. The focus on our episode, that's going to be the proper relationship between the federal and the state governments. And we'll talk about this for a little while, so you'll definitely want to stick around. The federal government, and again, you likely know this just because I know you, my listener, but most people do not know this. The federal government is constantly operating miles and miles outside of their authority that has been given to them by the United States Constitution and by the states. Listen, the state governments created the federal government. Our public education has done a horrible job at teaching civics, and it's no surprise to me if you think about this. What incentive would our federal government have to properly teach states' rights? When the federal government has a Department of Education and they're overseeing the standards and even the curriculum that young people are being taught, why in a million years would they provide those young people with the information that is needed to form an effective counter to themselves, right? That just doesn't make sense. If you have an understanding of human nature, when? I mean, this almost never happens. When would the government decide, I'd have a good idea. Today, I think I'll limit my own power through quality education of the youth. That just simply does not happen. And so many people have been told that, and this is again by their public education teachers. They've been told that the federal government is supreme to the states. In fact, there's a phrase for this. They call it the supremacy clause. I remember vividly sitting in, I think it was my 8th grade history class, and being told that the federal government is essentially the big brother of the state government. And even, I'm somewhat of an outlier, I suppose. Even at that time in my life, I thought, what the heck? What is this guy talking about? You tell me the federal government? That's not the correct relationship between the states and the Fed. See, the Constitution can, for the sake of this conversation, it can be boiled down to a contract that was made among the states where the states had all agreed, okay, we are going to create a new entity and we're going to give that entity a handful of powers. Everything outside of that would be a violation of the contract that we're all freely entering into, right? It's a pretty simple way to view it. And so in the Constitution, which was the contract between the states, they came up with a couple of powers. They outlined them in Article 1 of the United States Constitution. That's today's homework, I guess, is to go and read them. There's 18 enumerated powers that are specifically given to the United States Congress. Congress has those authorities. And I just want to be very clear here, in those 18 specific subjects, within the boundaries of that, the federal government is legitimately supreme. In fact, you can find some, more information on this in Article 6 of the United States Constitution, the so-called Supremacy Clause, which is grossly misunderstood, which essentially says that all federal laws passed in pursuance of the United States Constitution, the Constitution and all federal laws passed in pursuance thereof, I believe is the specific language in Article 6, that is the supreme law of the land, as well as some treaties, and there's a couple of other things listed, but for the context of this conversation, that's what's relevant. Laws passed by Congress in pursuance of the United States Constitution or in alignment in accordance with the United States Constitution, That is the supreme law of the land. So that harkens right back to Article 1, where we find the 18 enumerated powers of our Congress. Anything outside of that, and if you're not familiar with what those 18 specific powers are, again, we'll toss that on to you. That's today's homework. Go and read the 18 enumerated powers. But they're things like coining money and issuing patents and raising a military and calling out the militia to repeal a foreign invasion and things like that. Okay, it's very specific powers that are understandably delegated to a federal government. But if you read the 10th Amendment, you'll see that literally everything else, in fact, all powers that are not specifically given to the federal government, nor prohibited from the states, are reserved for the states and the people, respectively. What does that mean? That means that if it's not one of those powers that has been previously in the Constitution specifically given to the federal government, in all matters outside of that, the state government is supreme. Why is it that no one, and every time I say this kind of thing, someone comes out of the woodwork and goes, well, nuh-uh, I was taught that in public school. Okay, I'm happy for you, man. I am so happy. I wish everyone was taught this in public school, but it's my experience that very, 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 very few people are learning about the proper relationship between the states and the federal government. Why is it that basically no one really knows the Constitution anymore? Why is it that so few people are fluent in the powers of Congress? They're not fluent even in our own rights. I mean, listen, here's the thing. I've said this before, and I'll say it again 1,000 times. Properly executed, with the prerequisite assumption that our elections are free and fair, properly executed, our Republican system of government is essentially a mirror. When we look at the current state of affairs in our country, specifically in our government, what we see is basically a reflection of the people. If the people are uneducated, if the people are uninformed, uninvolved, and stupid, then trust me, the government will reflect that. Oftentimes, we look to other things. I've talked in the past, long-form discussions about, for example, term limits and things like that. We will often look to these other things, which, again, if you want the whole conversation on that, go listen to a previous episode. But we'll look to these other things and we'll think, man, if we just had that, if we just had term limits, then all of these other issues, they wouldn't really be a problem. No, that's not true. As long as we, the electorate, remain stupid, we will continue to elect stupid people. And that's not to say you're stupid or I'm stupid. I'm certainly not saying that. But if the general voting populace is not educated on their own rights, how in a million years could we, the people, have the audacity to believe that our elected officials are going to honor those rights? I think sometimes we have kind of delegated the authority to the court system, and we've used that as a bit of a crutch where we say, well, if Congress isn't allowed to do that, the courts will figure that out. The courts will come in and they'll tell us, I remember even being taught that was like the specific job of the Supreme Court, is that they're going to tell us what's constitutional and what's not. And they do that through what's called judicial review. Funny enough, and we've talked about this as well, funny enough, that's actually not found in Article 3. Article 3 of the United States Constitution lays out the powers of the United States Supreme Court. Nowhere in there. I think that's a pretty important omission. There's a big Supreme Court case, the most important one of all time, Marbury-Madison, where they gave themselves this authority. But that's a pretty interesting omission. The founders didn't want the people to be relying on the government, because the Supreme Court is part of the federal government. They didn't want the people to be reliant upon the government to tell them what their rights were. That makes no sense. Listen, I put a video out about this on social media, and if you don't follow me on social media, be sure that you do. By the way, real quick plug, share the show. We have a lot of people that are listening, but there are a lot more people that need to hear this. If you love the show, I want every one of you to go and share this with somebody. You all know someone that we can share this with. Continue to help me get this message out. I would appreciate that greatly. But I posted a video about this maybe the other day, I don't know when this was, where I said, a free people do not ask permission to exercise their rights. Free people don't have to pass a test to exercise their rights. Now, I said that in the context of the Second Amendment, the First Amendment. It would be egregious to propose that we have to ask our government, hey, can I have my free speech? Do I have to fill out an application so that I can have the permission to, say what it is that I believe? In the same way, it would be egregious, in my opinion, to require, the people to have some sort of a test before they can have a gun or something along those lines. We don't do that stuff. A free people does not ask their government for permission to exercise their rights, but in order to do so, they have to actually know their rights. And so when it comes to these issues, we have to know, we as citizens, not subjects, but citizens, we have to know our rights like the back of our hand, because otherwise, if we don't, our government will be a reflection, like I said, of our own ignorance, our own incompetence, and in a way, we the people, not you and I as individuals, but we the people deserve the form of government that we have, okay? And unfortunately, right, we would like to think that the public school system is going to do a great job of explaining to the American youth how our system of government is supposed to work, but as we've covered, that's just not going to happen. And it's so frustrating to me to see the number of people who just don't know that the states created the Fed. The states are not subservient to the federal government. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, he wrote in what's titled the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. He wrote about a concept called nullification. I mentioned earlier in the program that Article 3 of the Constitution doesn't actually give the express power to the United States Supreme Court to overturn a law as unconstitutional. That's just simply not in Article 3. The Supreme Court actually had to give themselves that power. Again, in the case Marbury versus Madison, they decided that they had what was called judicial review. But Jefferson appears not to have been a subscriber to that. He had an alternative that he laid out in these Kentucky and Virginia resolutions called nullification. And the idea with that was that the people would be so well-versed in their own rights in the Constitution that the burden would actually fall on them, not on a bunch of unelected, potentially robed tyrants, but instead on the people, so that if Congress was to take an action outside of those 18 enumerated powers, or if the president was to do something outside of his authority in, Article 2, rather than the judges stepping in and correcting that, it would be the people through the states that would stand up and say, no, we are going to nullify that. We're going to essentially ignore that law in our territory. For example, in the state of Missouri, right? Fantastic Second Amendment laws. Well, say that Joe Biden, I know this is quite the hypothetical, you can't hardly imagine it happening. Say that Joe Biden decides that he wants to pass something that is flagrantly unconstitutional. No question about it. He wants a forced gun buyback or something like that, right? Let your imagination run wild here. The federal government passes a law. The state government looks at that law and says, no, hang on. I'm not playing along with that one. Remember the contract that we have. You are operating way outside of the contract. In fact, not only are you operating outside of the contract, you are doing exactly what the contract prohibits you from doing, right? Shall not be infringed in the case of the Second Amendment. The federal government cannot do that. That's one of the things that they are specifically, it was like a point of clarification, the Bill of Rights, to make sure that nothing like that ever happened. Well, if the federal government was to do that, Jefferson said that it's actually on the state government to say, no, we're not doing that. We're simply ignoring that law. We are nullifying it. Well, this whole conversation, you might ask yourself, well, where did this get lost? Why did we stop teaching this? Why did we stop learning this as a people? A lot of that goes back to the Civil War, the concept of states' rights, and that's a conversation for a whole nother day. Ironically, I've said this a couple times today, but we do actually have a conversation that goes into that. I did touch on that in a previous episode, but I digress. Ever since the Civil War, the concept of states' rights has had a bad taste in people's mouths, understandably, because it was used, this idea of states' rights was used in defense of the morally abhorrent practice of slavery. But as it pertains to something like, for example, the Second Amendment, states' rights were a crucial aspect in the way that our system of government is supposed to work. You know, liberals will tell you all day long that they hate states' rights. That was settled in the Civil War. You know, they love the supremacy clause, right? They'll teach that constantly, like I said, in the public school system. However, a little caveat here, this concept of nullification has not only been applied by conservatives who have an originalist understanding of the Constitution or a correct understanding of the Constitution. No, this has also been applied by liberal states. Believe it or not, they've nullified federal law, which classifies marijuana as a federally prohibited drug. We had, I think, what was it, Colorado was the first state in the union that said, no, actually, we're going to smoke pot, okay? We're just going to do that anyway. And now I think it's the majority of all states. Well, how did that happen? Well, nullification. The state said, no, too bad, federal government, we're going to do it anyways. And in that case, the people are on the side of, in those states, they're on the side of legalized marijuana. And so the federal government really just hasn't done anything about it. They'll still say, well, you're not supposed to do that. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because of nullification. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin. He once issued the warning that we have a republic, but only if we can keep it. I don't know about you, but when I look around at the people in this country, the people who are voting, and even the people who are making the laws, or perhaps especially the people making the laws, I don't know that we can keep it. I'll say this much, though. I do not believe that the great American experiment was a failure. There are those out there right now who would say that the principles of self-governance have been a failure. I disagree vehemently. I don't agree with that at all. The United States, the American people, in the last 250 years of world history have accomplished the greatest accomplishments the world has ever seen. The United States is the most successful republic that the world has ever seen, the most successful country of any kind, any system that the world has ever seen. In fact, it used to be one of the metrics of an empire's success back in the day was how much of the world they were able to conquer. The British Empire, famously the saying was the sun never sets on the British Empire. They had conquered so much. They had so many territories and colonies. Genghis Khan, he ravaged Asia and got into Europe and the Middle East. You had, Alexander the Great. You had the Roman Empire. At the height of their power, none of them could compare to the hegemon level power that we had. The United States has been the top dog. Think, for example, immediately following World War II, we were the sole nuclear power on the face of the earth. For one time in world history, there was one country that could have conquered the entire world. We chose not to do it, but we could have. So by the old metrics of success, we are by far the most successful. If you believe, there's the conspiracy. If you believe we went to the moon, for goodness sakes, we went to the moon. Our country has produced the most innovation of any group of people in world history. The things that we've done, the technological advancements, the production, the culture, and the arts. And, we're seeing these things degrading as, time goes on. Our art and culture has become very degenerate and immoral. But prior to just recently, the last 20 years or so, the United States, despite some of our flaws, despite some of the black eyes, which we have had, the United States and the great American experiment has been a smashing success, entirely unrivaled by any other system of government and any other people in world history. So there are some who would say that we have failed. There are some who would say that freedom is too dangerous, even some on the right. In fact, maybe even particularly, there are some figures on the right now that are actually advocating for monarchy in a way. They're saying that people are too stupid. People cannot lead themselves. And listen, I understand what might bring someone to that conclusion. If you look around right now, just go into Walmart, well, you might understand why some people would think that, but I'm telling you, I don't agree. I don't agree that the American experiment was a failure. I don't agree that we are too stupid to be free. I don't agree that there are other people out there who ought to be telling me the best way to live the most simple aspects of my life, like in many times a monarchy has. But the only way that we will continue successfully this American experiment is if we go back and we revisit what made us successful. One of the themes I've been hitting on an awful lot recently in this program is that the culture has begun to rot. And everything, if you've been a listener of mine for any time at all, you've probably heard me say this before, everything is downstream from culture. If our country's culture is godless and hedonistic and only in pursuit of self-gratification, then I promise you everything else is going to go to crap at neck-break speed. But if our culture has its moral foundation in biblical principles, the principles which built the West, and if our people are actually educated enough to understand the basic system of government that we have, which, by the way, this is a tangent. I can't help myself. I have to go down this tangent. There are people out there who think that the average American is not competent enough to understand the United States Constitution and apply it. Those people are liars. They are deceitful, evil liars. They are the enemy of the people. If somebody comes to you and they say that you don't know what you are talking about whenever it comes to the Constitution, if you actually do know what there's a prerequisite here. You have to actually know what you're talking about. But if somebody tries to disqualify you from knowing your own Constitution, because maybe you're not an attorney or you don't have a degree or you didn't go to school or whatever it might be, ignore them entirely. That person is a sick liar. The Constitution can be read cover to cover inside 35-40 minutes, and if you really study it, you can know it very, very well within a day, maybe 2 days. It was written intentionally, not for attorneys, not for congressmen, not for doctors, not for some sort of an expert. It was written for the average American. If you go back in American history, by the way, this is made very clear by the Anti-Federalist and the Federalist Papers, which were spread out throughout all of the people. The entire American population was reading debates between the leading schools of thought, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, whether or not to accept this Constitution. It was made so that everyone could understand it, so that everyone could get on board and everyone could apply it, so that everyone could hold the government's feet to the fire and keep them accountable to us, not to a congressman, not to an attorney, not to some expert specialist or a professor at a liberal university, but to you and to me, so you can know the Constitution and you can know it as well as anyone else. It doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much reading or that much understanding. If you want to be an expert on case law, yeah, that's going to take a little bit more time, but the proper understanding of the Constitution is incredibly simple to figure out. And they do not want you to know it. They don't want you to know our nation's documents. They don't want you to know the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, even going back so far as to go to the Mayflower Compact. But if we know these things, right? Sorry to get off track there. If we know these things, and if we know them well, we can continue the great American experiment, and we continue to be very successful. We can do greater things. We can pass on to the next generation even better. We don't have to have the pendulum swing so violently that we think we need a monarchy or we need complete and total anarchy or socialism or communism. We just need to do the American experiment right and pay attention. Now, with all of that said, I suppose it's only proper, given that this is the first program of Pride Month, that we do need to address that just a wee bit. Now, last year, I did a video on this that it's still up, surprisingly, actually, shockingly. I would have assumed by now Facebook, or YouTube, I should say, would have taken it down. But I did a video as to why Pride Month, really specifically for Christians, why Pride Month is not something that we should be okay with. And if you want to find that entire conversation, it's still up there and you still can, but I'm going to rehash a bit of that today. Our culture has become so caught up, so worked up into everyone needing to be tolerant of literally everything. And I tell you what, this may it may shock some people out there, it may not. I have become so much less tolerant in the last couple of years, and that's not actually a bad thing. Listen, tolerance is not always a virtue. In fact, it's a vice, given the right context. If you are tolerant of that which is actually evil, for real evil, that is not a virtue. That's not a good stance. You're not a good or moral person if you are standing around tolerating the normalization of something that is abhorrent, something that is wrong, or something, if you're a Christian, that has biblically been called an abomination. Well, Pride Month is sort of everything that I've just talked about. It's a month dedicated, for one, literally, to one of the 7 deadly sins. The Bible literally says that God hates pride. Pride is a terrible, terrible thing. And when you make your entire personality a sin, and then you are proud and boastful about that sin, I'm telling you, this is not something that our nation ought to be celebrating. A nation which has its moral roots in Christianity, when we begin to turn from those moral roots, everything goes to hell. Literally, everything starts to go in the direction of hell. And you might think, what's the big deal? What's the big deal with normalizing and celebrating something that traditionally has been viewed as immoral, rightfully so? What do you think is the harm in that? Let me ask you this. If you went back to the 1940s, the 1950s, what we have named in our country to be the greatest generation of men and women that we have ever seen, or at least the greatest generation since our revolutionary, our founding generation, right? If you went back in time and you told them that our country was going to dedicate an entire month. Think of all of the other things that don't get an entire month. I'm sure a list comes to mind in your head, things far more deserving than someone's sexual preferences. But if you went back in time and you told those guys, maybe the men who had just fought in and then won World War II, hey, Grandpa, great-grandpa, we are now the country you fought for, the country your friends died for. We are now, once a year, doing a public humiliation ritual where collectively our nation turns its back on God and our morality, and we celebrate what God has called an abomination. And we take so much pride in it that we've actually named the month Pride Month. What do you think that those guys would say? Do you think they're right? Because I do. I think that the greatest generation our country has arguably ever seen was probably right on most of those issues. Now, there's things, obviously, that they maybe weren't so great on. They probably didn't have the greatest understanding of some racial things and stuff like that. But as it pertains to this one, I think that they would have had it right. Something tells me that when those boys were, for example, storming the beaches of Normandy, they weren't doing it in honor of Pride Month. They weren't hoping that their great-great-grandchild ruined their bloodline, ended their bloodline by marrying another dude. Okay, that is not what was foundational to our country. And if you happen to be a Christian, listen, there's going to be Christians out there who say, Victor, that's not nice. You shouldn't say that. That's not nice, Victor. You're standing for biblical principles, but you're doing it in a way that's slightly abrasive. Well, for one, I am not comparing myself on equal standing to Jesus Christ, but I will point to him as the benchmark, the North Star of how we should behave as Christians, and Christ was incredibly abrasive at times. He flipped tables at times. He said things that were uncomfortable at times, and we, the church, we as Christians in this country, we have become so seeker-friendly and we've become so cowardly that we refuse to stand on biblical principles and acknowledge them for what they are. We refuse, in fact, to follow the blueprint that was left by Jesus Christ on how to handle these things. We should have love, right? We've heard that so many times. We should be loving and loving. And yes, that's a predominant theme of the New Testament. We should love our neighbor as ourselves. We should love God, obviously. But what is love? And I don't say that to spawn memories of that song in your head, but for real, what is love? From a Christian perspective, from the worldview that built the Western world, what is love? Love has a foundation of honesty. It has a foundation of truthfulness. Love requires you from time to time to do what Christ did and say, go and sin no more. When's the last time that the capital C church in this country had the audacity to follow the example of Christ and tell people to go and sin no more? We have pastors across this country right now who have become so cowardly. They've become so afraid of being canceled that they refuse to speak out on an entire month dedicated to sexual immorality and sodomy and pride. What are our pastors doing? Because they're not... Now, I don't say this about my personal pastors, just to be clear. But the capital C church, these pastors who are not mentioning the great evils of our time, not just in this regard, but in many other circumstances, they have become so pacified and cowardly, outright cowardly, that they ignore the issues around them, and instead they've become nothing more than motivational preachers, motivational speakers. They get up every Sunday and they tell you some feel-good message of, oh, you know, I've got good stuff for you. And listen, the gospel is good, and church should be something that is refreshing, and I get all of that. I'm not saying that we can't have a good, warming, welcoming, encouraging place on a Sunday, but what I am telling you is in the face of tremendous evil, there should be a comment from the pulpit. The pulpit should have the moxie, the courage, the masculinity to stand up and say, no, what's happening actually is wrong. Here's what the Bible says about pride. I've heard so many times people will say, we need to be teaching LGBTQ history in our schools. I think they might be right. Let's start teaching about Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's start teaching that from the pulpit first. Before we talk about getting that into the public school, let's talk about that from the pulpit. Let's do it correctly. Let's do it with love. Let's do it following the blueprint that was left by Christ, for example, with the woman in the well, or, for example, the woman caught in the act of adultery. A good comparison, sexual immorality to sexual immorality. He loved that woman, but he told her to go and sin no more. Whenever it comes to this stuff, ignoring it is not the answer. When it comes to the social rot and decay, again, outside not just Pride Month, though certainly at this moment in time, it certainly applies. But in all of these circumstances, as Christians, we ought not ignore it. We ought not pretend that we have to hide behind the cowardly excuse of not wanting to offend somebody. The truth can be offensive. Jesus was very offensive at his time. They had him killed, right? The leaders, the Jewish leaders of the time, Pharisees and Sadducees, they literally had him killed. He was so offensive to them and their power structure and etc. There were a lot of people that didn't like him because he told the truth, but there were also a lot of people who came to the knowledge of Christ. They got saved because of him and because of his example. People don't typically actually want to be left to wallow in their sin. They just want to know the correct way out, and that's Jesus Christ. Anyways, be sure to share the program. Thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week. Until then, keep me in your prayers. Keep your country in your prayers. God bless.